Hey there, my name is Ben Cushing. I'm a faculty member in sociology at Portland Community College in Portland, Oregon. I'm standing here today at Willamette Falls and the site of the Blue Heron Paper Mill. This place is extremely historically significant in the history of the Pacific Northwest. Prior to the U.S. colonization of this place, this was the site of a really significant Clackamas community. And after white settlement and colonization of this place, this became the first incorporated city in what's now Oregon, and the site of the first major capitalist industries in the Pacific Northwest. Also the first capital of the state of Oregon. And so this is a place with a lot of history, and in many ways a lot of ugly and painful history. So I'd like to talk today about the connection between the climate crisis and the social institutions which have produced it. What I'd like to do is apply some sociological concepts to an analysis of the climate crisis. I want to ask questions like, beyond carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, what are the root causes of the climate crisis? How can we begin to trace those roots? And what can we learn as we do that? Natural scientists, climatologists, meteorologists, various kinds of earth scientists have done wonderful and remarkable work tracking the climate crisis, describing its mechanisms, and really helping us understand what its many catastrophic implications include. Sociologists are a little bit late to the party, but I think we have a lot to offer in terms of thinking about the social, historical, cultural, and institutional roots of the climate crisis as it exists now. So one thing that sociologists have to offer is a certain perspective on thinking about social problems or thinking about problems. A sociologist by the name of C. Wright Mills gave this the name of the sociological imagination. It's a way of looking at the world that emphasizes systems and how all of us live our lives embedded in social systems that are quite a lot bigger than us, that in sometimes sort of push us around and shape our experiences. So C. Wright Mills said that to understand our own lives, we need to understand how our lives are contextualized within various social systems and shaped by various historical forces. One way of thinking sociology, or one sort of skill set that can help you get into this way of looking at the world, is to be able to distinguish between two types of problems that we might face. The first is an individual trouble or an individual problem, and the second is a social problem or a public issue. So the basic difference between these two things, aside from scale, is that a social problem, unlike a private issue, has a root cause that is somehow connected to the system of society itself, right? So there's something going on in the system that is causing or producing this problem, right? And by extension, the solution to that problem will also need to be systemic, right? By contrast, a private issue or a private problem is something that has its root cause in someone's own private experience or private lives, and the solution to that problem will be at the scale of their own private lives, right? Something needs to happen at that smaller scale. So being able to distinguish between these two things, and importantly, not confusing one for the other, is a really important first step to thinking sociologically, right? So let's take an example that isn't connected to the climate crisis first, to help kind of practice this way of thinking, and then we'll apply this to the climate crisis in a minute. So take, for example, the issue of unemployment. If you were to have a city the size of Portland that had almost full employment, and there were maybe 3 or 4 or 5 people in the city who were unemployed, you could very reasonably assume that probably the cause of those people's unemployment is private, right? There's something going on in their private lives that has prevented them from getting a job or being able to get a job, right? And so the solution, therefore, would be to address something in their private lives that maybe they need or whatever, who knows. However, if in a city the size of Portland there were 200,000 people who were out of work, it would no longer be reasonable to look for the solution of an individual person's unemployment within the individual person. So there must be something going on in the larger economy, the larger system, that's causing unemployment for so many people. In actual fact, we've been living in an economy for the last 40 years or more in which issues of economic inequality and economic precariousness have been increasing. So for 40 years of kind of trickle-down economic type policies, we've been watching the middle class slowly shrink, the working class get poorer, and the rich get fabulously richer, right? So this is kind of the economic context of any discussion of unemployment or economic security today, right? So we've seen wages declining, we've seen deindustrialization as American industries have sought to cut costs and increase profits by both automating much of the production process and moving much of the production process overseas, where those corporations can access cheaper and more vulnerable labor. We've also seen, as a result of the decline of industry or industrial jobs, we've seen a decline in union representation of the American workforce. So as those factory jobs, which were often organized by unions, as those declined, and those also were jobs that paid fairly well and often provided economic security, retirement package and medical insurance and so on, and full-time work. Those jobs were eliminated by and large, and the jobs that came to replace them are service sector jobs. Jobs at fast food or retail sales, maybe call centers. And these service sector jobs, now like Amazon fulfillment stations, right? So these retail jobs tend to be part-time. They tend to pay minimum wage or just a little better, and they often don't have union representation. They don't have benefits, and so they're jobs that are not as good as jobs for workers, right? So this is part of the economic context that has to contextualize any discussion of economic insecurity today. So at the same time that all that's happened, the economy has also changed in a way that has made it more difficult to pay for the basic necessities of life. So housing costs have gone through the roof over the last few decades. Healthcare costs have gone through the roof over the last few decades. Any students watching this know that education costs have gone through the roof over the last few decades. And so we've seen a situation where the cost of living has gone up, whereas the cost of labor has gone down, right? So that leaves a lot of working people in a really tight spot. Some sociologists have started to use the term precariat to describe the new working class. Precariat combining the word precarious and proletariat. So the precarious proletariat who more and more lives on the edge of a knife, paycheck to paycheck, trying to get by. So it's into that context, of course, that this current COVID-19 pandemic hit us so hard. And of course, it's hit people in the service industries the hardest, because those are the folks who can't easily transfer their work to home. They can't, for example, give college lectures in front of a waterfall, recording it on their phone like I'm doing right now, but instead have to either go to work and put themselves at risk or are out of work, right? So the type of folks who tend to work those kind of jobs tend to be more likely to be women, and tend to be more likely to be women of color or people of color in general. And so what we see is that the pandemic is hitting people in really unequal ways, but in ways that are actually fairly predictable given who's already vulnerable and taken advantage of within the society that we live in. So if you were, with all of that as context, if you were to think about a person in Portland today who is recently experiencing unemployment, they've lost their job as a result of the pandemic. The fact that they've lost their job means that they're no longer able to keep up with rent, so now they're looking at eviction and houselessness. Since they lost their job, if their healthcare was attached to their job, they've now, in the midst of a pandemic, lost their health insurance. And so their economic situation is really dire. if we were to look at that problem that that person's facing and decide that it was a private issue instead of a public issue, we'd make all kinds of devastating mistakes, right? So not only would we fail to understand what this person's going through, or if the person themselves is asking, like, what is the cause of the thing that I'm facing, they'd fail to understand what they were going through. But they would also be less prepared to connect the dots between what's happening in their lives and the ways that they could actually go about impacting the causes of their own experiences. So if they think that it's their own fault, for example, that they're unemployed in the midst of a global pandemic, they might begin to internalize some sense of shame or self-doubt. They might search for solutions to this problem that are entirely individual, right? So they'll perhaps, try to beef up their resume and go out and pound the pavement and look for a job. Now, that might be a really good idea in any event, but what it doesn't do is address the systemic root of the problem itself, right? So when we fail to connect the dots between social issues and private experiences, as the old feminist slogan goes from the 70s, if we fail to understand that the personal is indeed political, then we're not prepared to engage at the level of systems or policies that could improve our situation and improve the situations of other people who are going through the same thing that we are. So when we do understand systemic causes to the problems we face, we can begin to intervene in those systems and improve the systems that affect our lives and the lives of other people. So now, with that kind of background in terms of system thinking and linking individual experiences to larger systems, and understanding that the way that we think about the root cause of the problem shapes the kind of solutions that we're going to try to develop. Now that we have that kind of under our belt, let's return to the climate crisis for a minute. Just as unemployed workers in the United States for the last 40 years have been encouraged to imagine that their unemployment is purely a private problem, purely their own fault, and that the solution is entirely private, we have also been encouraged to think about the climate crisis in a similar way, right? So we've been told the climate is coming apart. The living systems of the world are unraveling. What should we do about it? The answer has been a private answer, right? We should look at our carbon footprint. We should drive less. We should take shorter showers. We should recycle, right? Now, all of these things are good things, and in and of themselves, I think we should be doing these things, right? But what happens is that we end up failing to address the root causes of the climate crisis, and instead putting the onus of the climate crisis on individuals. Those individuals, some of you might relate to this, I certainly do, might begin to feel a sense of shame that they're not doing their part, that the world's coming apart, and they're still taking long showers at the end of a hard day at work. So, if indeed individual private solutions aren't going to cut it, we need to know what the systemic root causes of the climate crisis might be so that we can begin to intervene at that level. How can we begin to find systemic solutions for systemic problems? As the sign that you might have seen at some climate justice marches and protests that many people have been carrying, system change, not climate change, right? How do we begin to think about how you can change systems in order to prevent the worst of the climate crisis? So what are some of the possible systemic roots of the climate crisis? Well, there are tons, right? But I want to focus on a few. I want to zero in first on the economic system, and second on the belief system, okay? And I want to talk about two kind of sub-points within each of those, two parts of the economic system, two parts of the belief system. So in sociological terms, we're talking about culture and social structure, right? Culture is the belief system, social structure is, the economic system is part of the social structure. So, all right, let's think about the economic system first, the social structure. At its very foundation, a capitalist economic system requires constant growth. If you ask any economist at any university in the world, and you ask them like whether or not growth is important to a capitalist economy, they will all tell you a capitalist economy that isn't growing is failing, right? Capitalist economies must constantly be growing, and one of the ways we measure this is through gross domestic product, or GDP, right? So policymakers, international development professionals, economists, all spend a lot of time thinking about gross domestic product, which measures economic growth or economic output of a society or a country. It isn't rocket science to know that constant growth in an extractive economy, when you have a limited set of resources, is unsustainable, right? So what we get into a situation is, the situation we find ourselves in is one in which we have to constantly be making the economy extract more, produce more wealth, and grow, even when more and more we're understanding that is extremely dangerous to the future of the living systems of the world and to the future of our own communities and our own society. So the economic system that we live in systematically prioritizes profit above pretty much anything else and growth above pretty much anything else. This takes on a really specific form within the structure of the corporation itself. The corporation is arguably the most important institution in modern society. Corporations are extremely powerful today, and so they impact our lives in a huge number of ways. Given that that's true, it's really important to think hard about what corporations do, how corporations are structured and incentivized. A corporation in the United States is required by law to prioritize profit over any competing interest, right? So if a corporation makes money in ways that hurt communities or hurt the environment, we might actually be wrong to just say that the individuals who run that corporation are like bad and greedy. We'd be much more accurate to say that they're playing the game that is being played exactly as it's designed to be played, right? So a corporation is required by law to put profits over all other competing interests. Let me give you one really concrete example of this, which relates in really troubling ways to the climate crisis, and that's the example of ExxonMobil. So beginning in the late 1970s, Exxon began to conduct some of the best climate research that had ever been conducted up until that time. And between 1977 and 1981, climate scientists at Exxon learned most of what we really need to know about the climate crisis, most of the basics, right? So they learned that the burning of fossil fuels, like Exxon's product, oil, was releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which was contributing to the greenhouse effect and causing the world to warm, and that there were all kinds of negative consequences to that warming, one of which might be, or one of which is sea level rise, or the increased power of storms like hurricanes, or a kind of ricochet between extreme drought and flooding, or wildfires like we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest. Basically everything you can see in the background here, including my home, which is right over there, was forced to evacuate this summer because of the wildfires in Oregon. Many people weren't as lucky as we were and lost their homes, right? So we're seeing wildfires not only in the Pacific Northwest, but in the Amazon and in the Arctic. So we're seeing all kinds of negative consequences as a result of the climate crisis, and Exxon scientists understood this as early as the late 1970s, right? I was born in 1981. I wasn't even born yet, and Exxon knew. And so what do they do with this information? This information that the continued use of their product would contribute not only to the unraveling of environmental systems, but also to incredible disruption of human systems, right? Because they also understood that climate change would contribute to famine and refugee crises as people were forced to leave one area and migrate to another, et cetera, et cetera. What did they do? Exxon chose to bury their own science and invest in a public relations campaign to create misunderstanding about climate science and to create a sense that the research was really inconclusive, we shouldn't take any action yet, the jury's kind of still out, right? So what do we make of an economic system that compels people to literally prioritize the short-term economic interests of their organization over the long-term health and sustainability of human civilization? It's a kind of a remarkable thing. Okay, so that's a little bit about the economic system. We're thinking about the root causes of the climate crisis, and we're going to talk a little bit about both the economic system and the belief system. So that was a little bit about the economic system. Let's talk a little bit about the belief system. So sociologists and other academics who study culture study a lot of different things, but one of the things that they study is the way that our language shapes our understanding of the world, right? And so a really important concept in sociology that's often used to describe this process is the notion of a social construction. A social construction is a category that is embedded in our language that we use to kind of organize and make sense of the world, right? So one of the places I often begin with my students is to say, does Wednesday exist? And then they talk about whether or not Wednesday exists. Well, it seems to exist. It exists in our experience. We talk about it, but there's nothing inherently true about Wednesday. There's nothing material that makes this day Wednesday and not Thursday, right? So that's a social construction, Wednesday is. It's a category in our minds that we use to organize and make sense of the world. It's really useful for making sense of the world around us and having a shared sense of reality, but it's not inherently true. It's not materially objective. So one really important social construct in this culture, the culture that is dominant in the United States, is the notion of nature, right? So we have this idea that there is a thing that is nature and it's separate from humans. So there's like us and them, humans and nature. And so what this does is it constructs what sociologists call a socially constructed dichotomy. A dichotomy is a relationship between two categories that present the two things as opposite, in opposition, and inherently different, right? So this socially constructed dichotomy of human and nature presents humans as rational, civilized, perhaps progressive, as agents, as doers, right? And presents nature as irrational, wild, perhaps dangerous, static, and as a series of objects or things. So humans are subjects, actors, nature is things, objects acted upon. So this framework, like most of these socially constructed dichotomies, is not only a way of understanding the world, it's a script for relationship, right? It tells us what kind of relationship we should be in with the other things in the world, the other beings in the world, right? So it tells us that the relationship between humans and nature is one of in which humans sort of disregard and objectify nature, in which humans create relationships of dominance over this thing, nature, and in a capitalist context, in which humans extract resources in a linear and non-reciprocal way. So we have this socially constructed dichotomy of human and nature. It shapes the way that we see the world, and it also kind of calls into being certain relationships, certain forms of behavior between people and the non-human living world. Another really important socially constructed dichotomy to understanding how we got into this crisis that we're in emerges from the experience of settler colonialism and the experience of slavery. And these are the white supremacist cultural constructs that are really grounded in American culture and in many cultures around the world, which frame white folks as rational and civilized and progressive and as agents, and frame people of color as irrational and wild and dangerous. And just as those socially constructed dichotomies between humans and nature shape relationships, these socially constructed dichotomies also serve to justify relationships of dominance and exploitation and violence. So they create a sense of disregard, a kind of dehumanization of the other, and a justification for violent social control. So it's no accident that the settler colonial culture not only says we need to tame and harness wild rivers, but also uses the same language to describe the process of dominating and exploiting enslaved black people, or taking the land of indigenous people and sending the children of indigenous communities to boarding schools. So just right behind the camera is downtown Oregon City. And in downtown Oregon City in 1850, the first newspaper of Oregon was published. It was called the Oregon Spectator. And in 1850, they published an article that said, quote, "The Indian retreats before the march of civilization and American enterprise. The howling wilderness is fast becoming fruitful fields," right? So here, this newspaper article in Oregon is kind of expressing these social constructs that I'm trying to lay out here. It's a narrative in which white settler colonialism in the American West is defined as progress, as a great victory over a kind of wild savagery, which is both the wild savagery of the land and the alleged wild savagery of the indigenous people on it and in it, and whose ancestral home it was and is. So these ideologies, these belief systems function to justify various kinds of violence and extraction, and to wreak all kind of horror on people and on non-human people, or on the living system outside of humans, the non-human world. So all of this together is sometimes referred to as a kind of extractivism. This economic system of linear, extractive resource taking and consuming, combined with this belief system that frames the world as objects to be used as kind of utilitarian resources, and dehumanizes the world in that way, the non-human world. Also dehumanizes all kinds of people whose land is taken or who are put to work in this economy in ways that are exploitative. So those two things, the economic system and the cultural system, are often together described as extractivism, right? An economic and cultural system that's oriented around the extraction of resources and wealth from the world. So sociology can help us to see how deep the roots of the climate crisis go. They go into the heart of our economic system. They go deep into the history of settler colonialism, and they go deep into the culture that justified settler colonialism, into systems of white supremacy, and many other systems that we don't have time to talk about today. If that's true, if the root causes of the climate crisis go that deep, solutions at the level of individual behavior change will fall short every time. We can't recycle our way out of this mess, right? Individual behavior change is simply not enough, even if it's really necessary, right? What's required is so much more. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a report in 2018 which said that in order to prevent the most catastrophic consequences of the climate crisis, we had to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 95% in the next 12 years from then. It's 10 years from now, by 2030. 95%, right? For that to happen, everything has to change. We've seen just this year both the potential and the limitations of behavior change as a solution to the climate crisis. Because of the COVID-19 lockdowns that have happened all over the world in the past 7 months, we've seen carbon dioxide emissions cut dramatically. So emissions were cut by roughly 17% over a period of about a month at the peak of the COVID-19 lockdowns. So on the one hand, that's kind of remarkable to be able to collectively bring down carbon dioxide emissions that much. On the other hand, that's a level of behavior change that was both very painful for many people and also not realistic. And it only brought down carbon dioxide emissions by 17%. 83% of those emissions remained, right? So if we are to meaningfully address the climate crisis, we need to address its root causes in economic and cultural systems. And so hopefully sociology offers some of the tools for thinking about what that might look like. It's not an easy lesson. It's a kind of a painful lesson. All the way back in the 1950s, C. Wright Mills, who coined the term the sociological imagination, he said that the sociological imagination is a terrible lesson and a magnificent one. I think by that he meant that to understand how much our lives are impacted by systems can be a real harsh awakening. In some ways it makes us realize the limitations of our own agency in our lives. On the other hand, it's a magnificent lesson, because when we realize that we're embedded in systems and those systems affect our lives and the lives of the people around us, we can begin to act accordingly. We can begin to intervene in those systems in order to make our lives and the lives of others better. So, Naomi Klein, in her recent book is actually called "This Changes Everything." And in the title of her book, This Changes Everything, what she's getting at is the idea that the climate crisis will change everything about the world that we live in. Either we don't make big changes and the crises of the climate crisis kind of come down upon us in a reckless way, or we use the climate crisis as an opportunity to change everything, an opportunity to improve the systems that already needed improvement, already needed fixing, or maybe even to scrap some systems and develop new ways of organizing our economy or our society in ways that meet the interests or meet the needs of all people and of the land. So on the one hand, the downside of recognizing the systemic causes of the climate crisis is that we realize how everything has to change quick, and that's overwhelming to begin to get your head around. The upside of it is that it provides an unparalleled opportunity to change everything. And perhaps everything already needed some changing. Thanks.